Welcome back to Andersen Acres. We're in the kitchen again today because we are going to be baking bagels. I know we already did a bagel recipe a few months ago, but that was a very basic bagel recipe using my normal white dough recipe. That's not what I'm doing today. I'm doing a more traditional bagel recipe using brown sugar. So instead of referring you to another video to get the recipe, I'm going to do it from scratch because this is not my regular white dough. So I call these variety bagels just because I top them with different things, but really they're more of a traditional bagel. Now there are a lot of different recipes for more traditional bagels. This is the one I use because I like the flavor that the brown sugar gives, and then later when we do the honey bath, that just punches up the sweetness and the chewiness. So let's get started. So we're going to use the bread maker today because I don't have time. I never have time. So you can absolutely use your mixer or do this dough by hand. It doesn't really matter that much. So if you're doing it by hand or using your mixer, you have to set aside your dough to rise for about an hour to handle its first rise. If you're using your bread maker handles that first rise for you. So ingredients. The first thing we want 2 tablespoons of brown sugar. Okay, it's important that it's firmly packed into your tablespoons, and you definitely want brown sugar. Don't use white sugar. We want 1 teaspoon of salt. That's just regular table salt. You can use kosher, sea salt, Himalayan, doesn't matter. It'll all get you about the same result in this particular recipe. Now, you'll notice I'm not putting any butter, margarine, oil, or anything like that in this dough. There's a reason for that. This dough turns out better without any fat in it. The flip side, the only downside there is they will not stay fresh as long as they would if you had a bunch of oil in it. So you're going to want to eat these within 2 days. Okay, so there's no fat in this recipe, but you do want to eat these within 2 days after you make them. Not a problem around here. So we're going to add 1 cup of lukewarm water. Okay. We are going to add 3 cups of flour. Let's see if I can pull this off. I usually can't, but not so bad this time. I spilled a little on this side. Not a big deal. It's on my hand. Okay. So that's 3 cups of just your regular white flour, all-purpose flour or bread flour if that's what you're using. Doesn't matter. And then we're doing 1 heaping teaspoon of yeast. I'm using bread machine yeast. Obviously, if you are using your your mixer or you're doing this entirely by hand, you would probably use traditional yeast and dissolve that traditional yeast in the water and the brown sugar slurry before you make your dough. Now we're going to pop this in the bread maker. My dough cycle takes about an hour and a half, so we'll come back in an hour and a half, 2 hours, and start working on the dough. All right, so there we go. Our dough is ready. Now, it is a fairly sticky dough, but it doesn't stick to the hands. But if you squeeze it a lot, it should leave a little residue. So a little bit sticky, okay? What you want to do is squeeze all the air out of it. Just give it a squeeze. Get all that air out. And then you want to take your rolling pin. You can shape your bagels in 2 ways. Either do it the way I'm going to show you, or you can do it by hand. So I'm going to use donut cutters or bagel cutters to form my bagels. This is a fairly small, about 2-inch, 2.5-inch cutter. This cutter is a good 3.5 inches, nearly 4 inches. I like using the bigger one, but if you want to make smaller bagels, the smaller cutter is for you. I'll put links to both of these in the video description. So roll out your dough. I'm using a rolling pin that has actually these little rings on the end so that I don't roll it too thin. So I'm rolling to 3/8 of an inch. Again, I'll put a link to this as well. It's really handy for doing things like bagels. Okay. So you roll that out. There we go. Then we take our cutter, put that in there, and rotate. And we just keep doing that till we fill up our dough with bagels. There we go. Okay, here we go. Just like that. Then we're going to want to get a pan. And we're just going to take the centers out and line them up on the pan. Just rip those centers out. They're already cut. Try to keep your bagel not too oblong. Try to keep it nice and round. And the center hole is really important because when you're boiling these later, which you do have to do, to have a real bagel, you have to boil them. But when you're boiling them, what you end up needing is the water to come through the center and help cook the insides properly so that you end up with a nice chewy bagel. So yes, you need that hole because bagels are kind of big, right? You want that circulation of boiling water. Okay, so you can now put this dough back together and roll it out again if you like, or squeeze it back together. I'll just show you the second method where you don't need any cutters. You rip off about what would be a good chunk for a bagel or a bun. You make a bun, so you kind of flatten it, and then gather everything at the bottom. Okay, like that. And then kind of give it a roll so that you kind of make that area disappear so you don't have so much in the way of pinched dough and it kind of just disappears into the ball. There. And then, so that's the bottom, so nice and smooth. You take your thumb, push it all the way through the center, like that. Give your bagel a squeeze, and then just kind of boop, 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 boop. Okay? Boop, 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 boop. And put that on your baking sheet. So you can do it either way. It doesn't really matter. You can shape them with your cutters, or you can do it by hand. It's irrelevant. You do it however you want to do it, however you like to do it. I like the uniformity of cutters, but it doesn't really matter that much. So we just doot. And you can make any size you like. That's the other benefit of shaping them by hand, is you can make any size you like out of your bagels. There we go. Okay, and I can get about 3 more out of this. There we go. So then you just take your pan and you fill it up with your bagels, leave them some space to rise, and you want to cover this with a damp tea towel and set it aside somewhere warm for 30 to 60 minutes. You want them to puff up and relax. You don't want to start working with them now because they're not ready. Okay, they're not at all ready for you to play with them. So you're just going to cover them with a damp tea towel and then just set them aside. I like to put them in my microwave because the microwave contains the heat and humidity and gives you kind of a more consistent temperature and humidity. But you can put them wherever you normally put your buns to rise. It doesn't really matter. If you rise your bread on your windowsill will work perfectly fine for bagels. Okay, so whatever works for you, that's where you put them. So 1 more to go. And you can use, I love using the cutter, it's my preference, but often I don't re-roll my dough and I just use my hands. There we go. So now we'll cover these up, set them aside to rise for 30 to 60 minutes, and then we will come back and we will boil our bagels. There we go. All right, so our bagels have risen. They are nice and poofy. So now what we're going to do is we're going to boil some water in a pot. It doesn't really matter how much, as long as it's not a huge pot. You can use a small or medium pot. It doesn't matter. So to that boiling water, we are going to add 2 to 4 tablespoons of honey. So I'm only adding, this scoop is big enough that that's about 2 tablespoons. So I'm only adding 2 tablespoons because I'm only doing 1 batch of bagels. If you had doubled your recipe, you would add a little more honey because you're going to have a few bagels to boil. So I'm just dissolving the last of the honey off my spoon. There we go. Now, as long as your water's mostly at a boil, you're fine. You just don't want your water temperature too low. So the bubbles are breaking the surface, so now I can start. What I have to do is I have to boil my bagels. So one at a time, I gently take them off. Don't worry about it too much. Pop them in, and you want to boil them for between 1 to 2 minutes. So at least 1 minute, no more than 2. Okay, so we're just going to leave that on one side for 30 to 45 seconds till it's surrounded by lots of bubbles, and then we're going to flip it over. You're going to want a slotted spoon for this because you don't want to be scooping water back onto your pan. So we're just going to flip him over. There we go. So you put him top side up first, boil him a little bit, then flip him back over. And I'm not going to make you watch all of the bagels because that's ridiculous. So you just do it with each bagel. And while you're doing that, you want to preheat your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. 375 if you like a browner bagel. I'm doing about 350, 360. So there we go. He's probably fine now. So flip him back over. He'll look wrinkly and crinkly. That's fine. Don't worry about that. So I'm just going to put a second one in, and then I will stop the video and we'll come back once they are all boiled. All right, so once I have boiled them all and they're all back on my pan, we'll come back. All right, so all of our bagels are boiled. They have these crinkly, ugly tops. That's fine. That's normal. You want that. So for this next step, we're going to need an egg, and we're just going to take our basting brush and just kind of beat that egg. Beat that egg a little bit. It doesn't have to be perfectly beaten. It's not that big a deal. So beat that egg a little bit. Take that egg and top each one of these bagels with the egg wash. You don't want to add any water to your egg wash because these are already quite wet from being boiled. So no water, just brush the tops. Now you want your bagels touching each other if you can, because that does make a difference. It does make the edges really neat if you touch the bagels, if they're all together. So don't space them out too much on your baking sheet. And you should use either a non-stick baking sheet or prepare your baking sheet ahead of time because these boiled bagels do sometimes want to stick. So either I'm using a non-stick liner, the copper liner, so that works really well, but you can also spray with cooking spray, or you can use some butter or some margarine to keep them from sticking, but do something to keep them from sticking because otherwise you may have a small problem. All right, so a couple more. Don't be too gloppy with the egg, and don't worry about using up the entire batch of egg because you don't need to use the entire batch. We'll scramble up the rest of it for the dogs or the chickens, depending. So set the rest of that aside. Now remember I said these were variety bagels, and I said that because we're going to do a couple of different toppings on them. The first topping we're going to do is poppy seed. So I have 10 bagels, so I'm going to do 3 poppy seed. Be generous with your poppy seeds. But if you're like me, there's a lot of people in your house who like different things. So not everyone here likes poppy seeds. I love poppy seeds, and I'll happily eat poppy seeds every day of the week. But neither one of my sons like poppy seeds. Neither one do. So because we know that ahead of time, what we're going to do is we're going to get ourselves some sesame seeds. So I'm just going to grab some sesame seeds out of this container here. So we're just doing regular white sesame seeds. In theory, you could do black sesame seeds, but I like the white ones for bagels, but black sesame seeds would work just fine. Okay, so I'm going to top 3 of these bagels with sesame seeds. But then I've got my other child, my other son, who doesn't like sesame seeds or poppy seeds. So for him, we're going to leave these ones just with the egg wash. So that's what I mean when I say variety bagels. 3 different types of bagels, 1 batch. So we're going to put these in the oven now, 350 to 375, depending on how dark you want them, and we're going to cook them for 20 minutes. We'll come back after 20 minutes. And there they are. Our 3 types of bagels are finished. You let them cook for about 20 minutes to start, 350 to 375, and then just keep letting them bake until they are the shade that you like. So if you like them darker, let them go to 25 minutes. That's about it for us here today at Andersen Acres. I do hope you'll try this at home. They're really easy to make and they're delicious. We'll see you tomorrow.